Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about, do you really need to sharpen your whole sword? Now it's a question that most people have never even thought about because they naturally fall into one of three categories. Category 1, well, the whole sword's sharp, so I'll sharpen the whole sword. Category 2, only part of it's blunt, so I'll just sharpen that bit. And Category 3 is sort of the compromise between the two. Well, I don't want to take off all the fittings for my sword, so I'll sharpen as much as I can with the fittings on. And so the short answer is yes, you do need to sharpen your whole sword because traditionally then that's how it's done. You take off the handle, the tsuba, the habaki, take off all the fittings and then you sharpen the whole blade and you put everything back on. But it's a lot of effort. It really is, and it's quite bothersome to do, so it turns off a lot of people from sharpening their blades. So do you really have to do that? So I'm going to be looking at it from 3 points of view. 1, functionality. 2, the techniques that you do with your sword. And 3, wear and tear and durability of your blade. So with regards to functionality, then when you do your chopping, then you'll notice that only the tip really gets blunt. And there's a reason for that. You see, when you swing your sword, then this bit here doesn't move very fast, whereas this bit here moves quite a lot faster because it's further away. And so that makes this bit really good for cutting because it's moving at a higher speed, so it's got more acceleration, more force going through the target, whereas this bit here is moving quite slowly, so it doesn't actually cut very well. And so then, by virtue of that, then this bit gets blunt, this bit stays sharp. So you really only need to sharpen this end in terms of pure functionality. And so the Koreans understood this quite well. They had a sword called the ssangsudo, which is basically the Korean greatsword. And it was a really big sword. It was about 1.5 to 1.8 meters long. And I'd like to read to you from Uyedo Tongji the account of the sword. So Chok Kye Kwang said, the length of the blade is 5 feet long, and the copper protecting the blade is 1 foot long. The total length of the sword is 6 feet 5 inches, including the handle, which is 1 foot 5 inches. So you see it's a very big blade, but they've got a foot long of habaki. They've basically got a subway of habaki because they understood they didn't need the whole sword to be sharp. And if you look at some of the modern ones, and they've even got an unsharpened section following that because they realized only the distal end of that sword really needed to be sharpened. And obviously this functioned very well for them. They used it to fight off pirates on the coast, used it in the war against Japan, and it was quite effective. So obviously the whole blade didn't need to be sharp, it worked well for its time. So now if we look at techniques, then in Asian swords fighting, it's very much slicing or stabbing. But in some German manuals you do see the Schnitt cut or the slicing cut, where you place the blade up against something and then you pull through to cut. And in a cut like that, you do need a lot more of the blade sharpened because you're traversing a longer length of the blade. And in Asian swords fighting manuals, I haven't seen that pop up, at least not in Korean manuals at least. But I do see it in Korean Gumdo. And I'm not sure whether that's because it's a modern addition to it or if it's just because they're trying to show restraint, not to harm their training partner by putting the blade up to them and then pulling through when they're training with wooden swords. But either way, it is still a valid cut. It's a valid technique that works quite well, and I've practiced it before. And so for those things, then you do need to have more of the blade sharpened. You can't just get away with sharpening the distal end. But if you look at purely Asian techniques, then back in the days of the tachi, where the sword was worn blade down like this rather than blade up like this, then you couldn't do a draw cut like you can from here, where you can draw and strike. So your defensive maneuvers were pretty limited. But from down here, if someone were attacking you, then you could pull it up like this. And what that usually did was you got a sharp blade across your body, so it deters someone who's attacking you unarmed. If they've got a sword, it's a bit different. It's more of a defensive thing. But for that, then you do need a sharp blade on the part closest to the habaki because that's the bit that's defending you. However, if you don't practice those two techniques, then is there really any reason for you to still sharpen your whole sword? So last comes down to wear and tear. I had a friend ask me, when you sharpen your sword, if you keep sharpening it, won't that gold thing fall off? And by gold thing, they were referring to the habaki. And that's a really good question from someone who's never seen a sword taken apart, because they don't understand that the habaki sits on a notch. And so then I'll put a picture up of it there, but you can see that the habaki actually has a notch that it sits on. So no, the habaki will not fall off. But it brings a good point. How much wear will sharpening do? And so that if you're sharpening on whetstones, assuming that you're competent, you know what you're doing, you're not going to damage anything, then you really only lose about 1/10 to maybe 1/20 of a millimeter of steel each time when you sharpen. If you're a professional sharpener, you can probably get away with less than that. But if you're sharpening on belt sanders, if you don't know what you're doing, then you can lose quite a lot more because it's got an aggressive machinery spinning sandpaper sheet that's taking away material quite quickly. But in terms of sharpening on whetstones, then no, I don't think you will ever sharpen to the point where you significantly lose enough blade. So that's whether you're sharpening the tip or the whole sword. Either way, I don't think you'll notice that much thing. So people also talk about distal wear, where you get a thinning of the tip. Probably won't happen unless you're aggressively sharpening or you're using a belt sander. Where you do lose a lot of material though when sharpening is if you've got a notch in your blade or a crack. Well, not a crack, a chip. Because there you've taken out material, so now you need to take off enough material until that's flat. So in those cases, I really do recommend that you sharpen the whole sword because you can get wear on certain points, and then you can have an uneven blade edge because you've taken away more material from a certain point. But if your blade is in good condition, you're cutting soft targets, you don't have chips or wear in it, then it probably doesn't matter. So the final verdict is, if you're not practicing the slice and cut and you're not in the samurai days with the tachi trying to defend yourself across your body, it probably actually doesn't matter what you do. You can sharpen your whole sword, you can sharpen just the distal end of it, or you can just do the lazy way and try and sharpen as much as you can with the habaki and the suba and the handle still on. And as long as you don't chip your sword. So stay safe, keep training, have fun, and I'll see you next time.